Hey there, Bob and Weave viewers. Just wanted to give you a quick heads up before this week's episode. We had some video problems. We have a very cool and very interesting episode in store for you. We have Rae Andreacchio, who was featured on the Culpable podcast. It's a nice long interview. We covered some great ground. However, Rae was filming herself on her end to be included in this video, and the battery died on her camera about 18 minutes in. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. Also, by the way, Zach's not here. So after about 18 minutes, Ray's video feed cuts off, and the entire remainder of the episode is just this one camera on me, which is not going to be super interesting. We decided to go ahead and put the video out anyway, but just so you know, after 18 minutes, it may be one you just want to listen to rather than watch, because to be honest with you, I don't even know what I was doing physically some of the time while Rae was talking. Just wanted to give you that heads up. I hope you enjoy the episode. And here is episode 15 featuring Rae Andreacchio. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Bob and Weave. This week we have a special guest with us, but it's also a little different because we is just me. Zach is actually under the weather today and had to call in sick. So it's just me, but luckily I am joined by I guess you were sort of the subject, but not really. It was more your son. But I'm joined by Rae Andreacchio, who a lot of you probably heard on the Culpable podcast. So thank you so much for joining me, Rae.
Well, thanks for asking me to come on and talk to y'all.
I guess what I was just stumbling through is a good place to start. It's a question actually our producer was just asking me. How did you get involved with Tenderfoot to do Culpable? Did you reach out to them or did they reach out to you?
Well, initially, just because there wasn't anything going on with the case and everything had gotten kind of quiet, I had thought that I would just do a podcast myself and just do, I knew no one would really listen to it except maybe locally people who were kind of connected to the case, but just to try to bring awareness. And so I actually reached out to Resonate because they did editing and all for podcasts. And I asked them, I was just trying to get an idea of how much it costs to have them edit and kind of help with a podcast. And they started asking questions about what I was trying to accomplish and what the story was about. And after about an hour and a half phone conversation, the guy stopped me and said, I think this is something that we may be interested in. Let me get, my bosses on the phone call. And so the next day we had a conference call with Mark Menery and Dennis Cooper and Jacob. And they said, we really think that we've been looking for a subject to cover and a story because we want to get into actually doing our own podcast. And so they said, instead of, you having to pay us to edit a podcast, why don't you just let us do it for you? And so that's kind of how it started.
Okay, and then what were you trying to accomplish by doing the podcast? Were you just trying to get more people involved in the case?
Yes, I think that, I don't know how many cold cases you've covered or whatever, but I think my experience in dealing with this for going on 6 years is you have these quiet spells where nothing's really going on. It's like you're either waiting for something to happen or you're waiting for the police or you're waiting for someone to retire and there's no media attention and everything's just kind of quiet. And I think as the parent who's trying to get something done, those periods of time get very almost more stressful than the times when there's a lot of chaos and commotion and media going on, because then you feel like there's momentum and there's something happening and you're getting something done. In those quiet spells, you feel like everybody's forgetting and nothing's getting done. And so I guess, yes, to answer your question, I think the goal was to just keep people interested and keep Christian's name and story out there until we could get something going, and to fill kind of that void, that quiet space.
So I guess with that, can you tell us Christian's story? You know, a lot of our listeners have listened to Culpable and are familiar with it, but some of them have no idea what we're even talking about right now. So can you tell us about your son and where all this started, what the incident was that sparked all this?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you an abbreviated version just because it's, it is a very long story because you're spanning a long period of time. My son, Christian, was 21 years old, and he was working on a tugboat on the Mississippi River and had been working there since he was 18. Very hard worker, very independent and goal-oriented. Of course, not perfect. I've been accused of, trying to make him sound like he was perfect, and I've always said that he wasn't perfect. He was like any teenage kid and young man. He, did things I didn't like and said things I didn't like, but, he was a good kid and generally well-liked and got along pretty much with everyone. Very good-hearted as far as, would give you the shirt off his back. He wasn't someone who was, always, not willing to share and that kind of thing, always kind of taking up for people. And he had gotten out of a long-term, 5-year relationship, really the only, relationship he'd ever been in, and kind of quickly rebounded into a real relationship with a young girl that was several years younger than him, Whitley Goodman, and very chaotic relationship. And so it kind of spanned from his 20s up until his death. They dated for 8 months, and she was, pretty wild in the drug scene, and didn't have that great of a reputation. She and I did not have a very good relationship at all. I felt like she was not, in the relationship for the right reasons. She referred to Christian as her gravy train. He made good money, especially for someone his age, and he was able to give her things, that she wanted and others weren't providing for her. So over the course of the relationship, there was a lot of things that happened at my home and between she and I and between she and my daughter. And they ended up moving. My son moved out in November. He just turned 21 on November 4th, and he moved out on November 7th. And they moved in with my oldest son, Josh. He was going through a divorce, and, he was needing a roommate. And so he had asked Christian to move in with him. And he did. And, of course, Whitley stayed there, too. And on February 26th, Christian got on the boat on February 22nd, and he would do a 30-day hitch. And on February 26th, he got off the boat because Dylan Swearingen, a mutual acquaintance of his and Whitley's, was calling him and telling him that Whitley was riding around in his car with another guy. And so Christian got off the boat, got permission to get off the boat until 5 o'clock that afternoon, and he was supposed to be back by 5. And the captain said basically he'd cover for him if he was back by 5. And, what he told Josh was that he was coming home to kick her out, get his car back, then go back to work. We were not aware. I spoke to him that morning. He had a normal conversation. He told me he was, taking a barge. He'd call me back later. He didn't tell me he was coming home, and the things that was going on between him and Whitley, but, he knew how I felt about that situation, so I'm not surprised that he didn't tell me. And when he came home, the next thing at around 6:30, 7 o'clock that evening, we received a call, or the police tell us that he had committed suicide in the apartment. And so then that has started kind of the trajectory of events that occurred over the next almost 6 years.
So, and the the Culpable podcast, and I can't recommend that enough to all of you listening as you're hearing Ray's story. I highly recommend to get the full story on Culpable. But there was a lot of mistakes made or some oversights very early on in the investigation, if you want to call it an investigation. And part of that was the police determined that this was a suicide, within 45 minutes?
Right. Yes, it really wasn't an investigation.
So the very basics are that he was found kind of slunched over, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, slunched over a bathtub, and he had a gunshot wound to the head, and there was already things that definitely jumped out at me right away were that looked like, I think they said the entrance wound was on the right side of his head, but the gun was decocked, first of all, is a huge red flag, and it was kind of pinned between his left leg and the bathtub. So there's just at a quick glance, something doesn't look right here.
Right. I mean, it was huge red flags from the very beginning, just even walking in, in the first 5 minutes. Definitely enough to where there should have been a lot of questioning, a lot of, people brought in that, possibly knew something, family question, but none of that happened. They really didn't even question Dylan and Whitley. They gave statements.
Right.
And they didn't question their statement. They didn't follow up when something didn't make sense. Simple things like that. Even I, who is not trained in any type of interrogation or questioning, if Dylan said, well, I came back and I watched a movie, or we watched a movie. Okay, well, what movie did you watch?
Right.
So that at least to be verified. There were no questions asked. Dylan ended up having gunshot residue on his hands, but his story is he wasn't in the apartment when the gun was fired, that he found Christian, and that he didn't go in the bathroom. He didn't touch Christian. So, why does he have gunshot residue on his hands? Whitley, same thing. Whitley had gunshot residue on her hand. She says that she slept through the gunshot. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg. There was no blowback, high velocity blowback on the gun. Christian was right-handed. There was no blood on his hand. From what I've been told, that's really just not possible. That there should be, with a close contact wound like that, gunshot wound, there should be blood even in the barrel of the gun.
Mm-hmm.
The gun had no prints on it. It was a custom Kimber 45, and it was manually decocked, and on his left side, which kind of goes against physics and the laws of gravity and everything of where it should have been.
Right. And let's talk about that gun for a minute, just for people that aren't familiar with what we mean when we say decocked. So you said the Kimber 45. I'm assuming it's the model of that is a 1911, which is a common Kimber model of 45, which is a semi-automatic pistol. Do you know if it was a 1911, or are you not sure?
No, it's a 1911.
Okay, yeah. So it's a very common gun, that style, and the style of it is like an old military type pistol is what they originally used for, and it's a semi-automatic gun, so a magazine in the handle, and you shoot as fast as you can pull the trigger. But that particular type of gun has a hammer, and when you fire the gun, the reason you can keep pulling the trigger is every time you fire the gun, the slide comes back to eject the shell and leaves it cocked, so you can just pull the trigger again. So if you were to commit suicide with it, when you pull the trigger, it would still be with the hammer set up with the hammer back ready to fire another round. The only way to get that hammer decocked or back down so it's not in that hair trigger setting, there's two ways with a 1911. One is to put your thumb on the hammer, pull the trigger, and gently ease the hammer back up. Or the other way is on the 1911s, if you flip the safety off and then back on, it will decock it. But none of those things can be done when somebody has just shot themselves in the head. It should have been found in the cocked position.
Well, exactly. And again, I'm not an expert in this at all, but from what experts have said, it should have, just from the force of the gun, it should have kind of flung, like his hand would have gone back to the right, and the gun would have dropped or been over to the right side. And there's just no really way to explain why it would be on the left side, but not just on the left side, but it was wedged between, it's being held in place between his thigh and the bathtub.
Right. And a lot of this, just kind of a trigger warning, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here is very disturbing, but it's something that I've actually lived through. So this podcast was it was rough for me to listen to, but it was also kind of important for me. I lost a very good friend 5 years ago who did commit suicide by shooting himself in the head with a .45 caliber pistol. Very similar, except for this one, we're sure it was a witness suicide, so we know what happened. But I learned a little bit about the forensics of what happens when someone does this from that incident. And when you're talking about blowback, I remember going to I didn't go, but I was talking to the victim's brother-in-law, who his sister, the man's wife, actually is the one that witnessed the suicide along with her son. And he came back from the funeral home and was confused. He said, her story doesn't add up, because she's saying that he held the gun on the right side of his head, but he was at the funeral home and saw the body, and the right side of the head looked more like an exit wound. That was the big blown out piece. And on the left side, it was just a small bullet size hole. And so we, in talking to the sheriff department, found that there's so much percussion that comes out of the gun at the muzzle when it's fired. When someone has the gun very close to them, there's a massive, the big hole comes from the gases that are blowing out from the gun, which is what causes all that, blood and skull tissue and hair and all of that to what they call blowback, like you're talking about, that'll end up all over the gun. And in this case, it was all over his gun. It was in the barrel. It was on his hand. All of that. So as I was listening to the podcast talk about that there was none of this blowback and there was no blood in the gun, on his hand, none of it makes sense, only because I've been very, very close, sort of. I mean, it wasn't investigating, but because of what I do, I was really trying to learn a lot about the forensics of what happened there. And none of this fits with that, with what I know to be reality in a situation like this.
Well, exactly. I mean, and again, I've just learned as I've gone along and listened to people and talked to people, and it just seems like that was again another red flag. And even the EMTs who came, they said that the scene did not, that they of course had been to multiple scenes where it was a gunshot wound to the head, whether it was an accident or whether someone killed someone, and they said the scene just did not. It wasn't messy enough. It wasn't, there wasn't blood and brain matter or whatever. It wasn't everywhere. I mean, really, it wasn't anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it appeared to have been cleaned up. Either their statement. One of their statements to me was, are you sure that he was even killed in the bathroom? Because it just doesn't look like he could have even been killed in the bathroom because it was so clean.
Right. I'm assuming you do have, and that the investigators and the culpable team had them, but the actual crime scene photos of the bathroom?
Yes. The investigators have them, and then we have, there were very few pictures taken just mm-hmm. because I didn't investigate, and we have the pictures that my son took a couple of days later when he went there, and then there are some pictures of that the police took. They took the pictures with their cell phones. They didn't actually take them with the correct equipment or whatever, which I found out later was against policy. But yes, they have them, and the crime scene photos were given to Knox and Associates, and then of course Arden. But now they got their photos directly from the police department. We didn't supply them with anything, because I know that's been some questions or whatever about, well, we only sent them what would make it look like it was a homicide, and it was like we didn't send them anything. The police sent them everything. So if you're going to blame anybody, blame the police. They're the ones who picked what they sent them.
Right. It's interesting. And now that I think about it, I think they mentioned it on the podcast that when you brought up Michael Knox, that they were aware he was kind of portrayed negatively on a Netflix documentary.
Right.
But what our connection goes a little deeper than that. So that case that was on the Netflix documentary was my case. It was one of our cases on Truth and Justice.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know anything about his. Not to disparage him. He was. I mean, he did a terrible job in the case we were working, but that was because he was doing something he wasn't qualified to do. His background is in accident reconstruction, which is what he was doing for you. And,
right.
And he had, in George Powell's case, he got contracted to do some photogrammetry work and didn't really have the know-how to do it properly. But it was just interesting when I was listening. I'm like, oh my God, I know I've learned a lot about Michael Knox when I was covering our season 4 case. This is kind of a small world. I guess a small community of all these forensic specialists.
Right, because, I mean, we had to go, they're in Jacksonville, Florida. We're in Meridian, Mississippi, so it wasn't like they were close, but they were probably, in what we found, they had a pretty good reputation in, like, crime scene reconstruction, which is what we were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, going back, I know my son listened to or watched the Netflix thing. I think that at the end, he kind of said that, right? That they didn't really have I don't know. I didn't watch it, but didn't he give some explanation to why that it was off? Wasn't it something to do about the height of a person or something?
And essentially what it was is, the way I took it, it seems like, just from watching the Netflix, like Michael Knox is probably a decent guy. Seems like a nice guy, but it sounds like he got some software that will do photogrammetry work, and so then he got hired to do this job and just plug stuff into the software and let the software figure it out without any, it'd be the same thing if I got, found some computer program that could do something that really requires a lot more skill. Is kind of what happened in the George Powell case, but anyway, his specialty was in crime scene reconstruction, which is what he was doing for you guys, and I think his determination was that he doesn't think that it was a suicide. Am I right about that? Was that him?
Right. Well, both he and Arden said that it was a staged suicide.
Right. And after we'll get into some of the other connecting factors here, but when I listen to it, obviously with for what I do, everything is science and photos, investigation, stuff that I haven't dug into and done. But by listening to it, I don't know if I have an opinion about whether I think that he was murdered or it was suicide. I just don't have enough information. But what seems very, very clear to me is that one way or another, Dylan and Whitley are not telling the truth, and the crime scene had clearly been manipulated. I can't tell you from my only because I have such a limited, scope of the case. I can't tell you if there was different circumstances that led to the suicide and they tried to clean it up, or if they murdered him. But it seems very obvious that I think most people could agree on that the scene had been absolutely manipulated. There's no way that it happened the way they're saying it happened.
Oh, well, definitely. And I mean, they even the police now, everybody involved says, oh, well, yeah, definitely he was moved. There were things done, but they don't really seem to care about finding out why that was done and questioning anybody or finding out, if there's those inconsistencies, and if they've lied about that, what else have they lied about?
Right. And why are they? The gunshot residue is a big deal. There's the whole, and listeners can go to listen to Culpable to get this full story. But that Whitley claimed as soon as they told her we're going to do a gunshot residue test, she's, oh, well, I'm going to be positive because I was shooting guns last night. And then there's the group of people, everybody's changing their story, and ultimately kind of sounds like she wasn't actually shooting any guns the night before.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, you have the people there. I mean, gun night appears what's kind of Culpable termed as gun night, the night before, where they are shooting guns, she and three other people. Um, it takes on more significance than maybe it should, or maybe, or maybe it is very significant because everybody couldn't get their story straight. And it's like they couldn't decide where they went shooting guns. They couldn't decide if Whitley shot guns. They couldn't decide, one person said she did, one person said she didn't. One person said they didn't remember. They kept the identity of the fourth person hidden, I guess you'd say, for years before it was determined who the fourth person was. In the police reports, it would just list out the three people and then say a friend. Instead of the police asking, well, who's the friend? They either didn't ask, which was crazy to me, or they asked and they just kept the name out for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of speculation about whether or not the DA's son was there, and we're still not sure that he wasn't there. When Culpable did the podcast, they actually interviewed Jess Miller, who was, one of the people there at gun night. And in that interview, he said, well, there's two people who's never been named that were there. But he wouldn't name them.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're looking, so we don't know whether he was talking about, the fourth person and another person, or he was talking, because Zach Tabb had been named. We don't know whether or not he was saying that there was a total of 6 people there. But bottom line, there was at least one additional person there that we still don't know who it was.
Right.
And so kind of the question still goes re-entered, was the DA's son there? Which is what we've always believed, and believe that that's how, why the DA has fought so hard to keep this from being investigated and prosecuted.
Right. And like you said, it was compelling in the podcast because they did a lot about the gun night and all the mysteries around it. But for me, just as an investigator listening, I'm like, oh, that's all fine and dandy, but what about Dylan? I mean, there's no reason he should have gunshot residue on his hands. He supposedly was at Best Buy or whatever, wasn't home or wasn't in the apartment when the suicide took place. He never touched Christian after he got there. He never, to me, I don't understand how the police just ignored the fact that he had gunshot residue on his hand.
Well, I never asked. I mean, when the test came back, they never talked to him again and said, why do you have the gunshot residue on your hand? I mean, there was just no follow-up. There's nothing. And then, of course, there was the whole thing that he went and tried to get Christian's money out of the bank.
Right.
And, that in itself was enough. I mean, even if you had nothing else, in most cases, that in itself would lead people to say, that seems a little shady. What was really going on with that? But they didn't seem to think that was unusual or should be questioned, or actually they didn't even go get the picture at the bank. I went and got it and then gave it to them.
Wow. Yeah, when I was listening to that too, the whole Christian told me to go get his money, and I went to go get his money, and that's, and I know there's since then, and we're going to get into here shortly, but how there's been kind of a data dump. You've been through a lot, very actually almost identical situation that I went through, and the Melgar family went through during our season 6 case with a group of, we'll get into that group in a minute, but in part of that we finally get some text message records. And I know that group doing what they do is making a big deal about it. But the first thing I thought was, because there's text in there, is it accurate? There's text in there where Christian is like telling him to go get the money and giving him a pin, and then also that he's like threatening suicide in the text messages. Is that accurate?
He doesn't give him I don't think he gives him the pin. The way that it was set up at that bank is if you came in to withdraw money, like in that kind of situation where it wasn't Christian, it's not the pin that you have to give. I didn't even know this until about 6 months ago, but they have a code word that is set up between them and the client. And so it's separate from the pin number.
Okay.
And, so even with them having a pin, if they didn't have the code, they wouldn't have been able to get money. And so, they said Christian would have known that because Christian, had done it before. He knew that they had to have a code. So we don't know who they were talking to when they text. There was a text saying, hey, dude, or man, I'm here. And he sends back and says, okay, I think there should be $1,300. But we don't know who sent that because we know that they were using his phone. They start making phone calls on his phone at 3:30.
Right.
And but because going by rigor and lividity, Dr. Arden says that Christian had to have been probably killed as soon as he walked in the apartment. There's no way to explain the level of rigor he was in by saying that he was shot at 3:30 or after. I mean, like they're saying.
Right.
And they really have never said, even in their statements, they never said when he was shot a time. It's just, I think that because of the phone calls that were being made at 3:30 on his phone, they put it at 3:30. But you waited, an hour and 15 minutes to call 911. You can't say, Dylan can't say, well, I called as soon as I got there, because he's making phone calls on Christian's phone at 3:30.
Right.
So, the whole story just doesn't even, add up. If you put down on paper Dylan's story of the events and everything that he supposedly did, and they watched a movie and he took an hour nap and all this, I mean, the time doesn't even fit into the time period they're trying to say.
Right. Well, and it was one thing that shouldn't be people will when they're trying to make their own argument fit, but you really can't argue with science and the lividity, especially, and the rigor evidence. Clear, there's some other witnesses that lead us to believe that the shot was fired much earlier in the day, but aside from those eyewitnesses or ear witnesses, we have the lividity clearly shows and the rigor that he had been dead for hours prior to when during the time when they're saying that he's hanging out with them, and so it's another indicator that clearly things have been manipulated and people are lying, in my opinion, from listening to the whole thing. But then you have to look at all of the phone records and figure out, well, was that actually him, or was that them, Whitley and Dylan and whoever else, was sending messages from his phone to make it appear as though he was alive, or to explain, help to explain their own behaviors, like going to the bank to get the money.
Exactly. And I mean, and then there's a message that's on his phone at, I want to say 1:30, that says, hey, it's sent from his phone to Matt Miller and says, hey, this is Whitley. You want to hang out? Well, Matt doesn't respond because he's at work, supposedly. And, but then the message is deleted. So if it was, some people, being devil's advocate, he says, well, that was Christian that was trying to lure Matt to come to the apartment. But why would he delete the message? The other messages aren't deleted. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's not like he's deleting. So why would he care if it was really him and he whatever? Why would he care? There's no reason to delete the message. So it's just a lot that lines up. And again, you can't argue with science. And that's what someone asked me not too long ago, if you had to pick the one most compelling thing that if you had to convince someone that this was a homicide, what would it be? And I said, rigor. I mean, we can't, there's no way that can be manipulated in this situation. It is what it is. And we know that there's no possible way that he was in that state of rigor and he was shot at 3:30, or that he was shot at 2:30, know, and even really 1:30. I mean, it had to have been, pretty much when he got there.
Right. And the lividity is super compelling to me because just from the investigations I've done, rigor is a little, and clearly in this case because of how well it was set in and how long that takes, it shows an earlier time of death. But lividity takes minimum 4 hours to fix, minimum, typically between 6 and 12 hours. And he had fixed lividity, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a month or so since I listened, but he had fixed lividity. It wasn't like on top of his calf or the upper part of his leg.
Yeah, it was on the back of his calf, which in the position that he was found in, there was no possible way for it to be on the top of his calf. It wasn't on his shin. It was on I guess I'd say the top of his calf. It would be the back of his calf.
It was defying gravity, basically.
Exactly. It's the opposite of where it should have been.
Right, because for those of you that don't know a lot about this, lividity is when someone dies and their blood stops, you start having blood pressure, your blood settles to the lowest point because of gravity. And then after about 4 to 6 hours, that area will become it'll permanently stain. They call it fixed lividity, kind of purple or red. And then even if you move the body, it will stay there. So he's on his knees with his calves pointing up, but there's fixed lividity on his calves, which indicates that he was actually laying on his back at in a seated position, not in that position, for a minimum of 4 hours before he was moved to where he was found.
Exactly. And there was also, an area on his back, I can't remember what side, but on this, there was a spot, kind of a strip on his, kind of the side, that never, nobody really could explain that either. Dr. Arden, of course, that was his two main points was that the lividity and the rigor. He said there's just no, he said that he was in such a state of rigor that they moved him and put him in the body bag in the same position, like it was almost like a fetal position, because he was, the way he was curled over the bathtub. And, he remained, that's how fixed it was.
Right.
So, there's just, again, no arguing with that.
Right. And that takes a long, because rigor, there's a range, but usually after it's like 10, if memory serves, like 10, 12 hours when it starts to set in. But it starts in the extremities, fingers, arms, hands. It takes a long time to get to the point where, like at the hips, it's fixed, which it was, he was rigid at the hips when they put him into the body bag, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
They couldn't lay him flat, which if he had just killed himself within the hour or 2 hours, he would have still been limp and been able to lay him in the body bag. But so there's a ton more interesting details to know about this case. Listen to the Culpable podcast to get those. It's a great story, telling by Dennis Cooper is the host, by Tenderfoot TV. A lot of good interviews, great podcast. I want to talk a little bit about what was the process of the podcast like for you. How long did it go on? And I know you're recording with me right now on your own recording equipment on your end. I'm assuming that's because the equipment you got for the Culpable podcast.
Right. Yeah. They. The whole process was. We worked on this almost a year. It was almost a year exactly, from first phone call to, when it actually started, the first episode. I think it was in June, end of May, 1st of June. And, it was, they came to, Dennis and Mark and Jacob came to our home, twice, I think, maybe 3 times. I think it was twice, and they stayed for several days. And of course, we just recorded, hours and hours and hours. And we met in Nashville. They ended up, incorporating Sheila Wysocki and her team of investigators into their podcast, as far as going to Key West and investigating and trying to talk to Whitley and just kind of investigating her behavior down there. And, of course, they came here and brought 10 or 12 investigators from all over the United States, and they kind of just converged on Meridian at one time because they kind of wanted to hit everybody in the same day or two, so there wouldn't be a lot of time for them to be talking to each other and coming up with, well, what did you say, and that kind of thing. And, made a lot of contact. Then a couple of the investigators came back here a second time, and we have gone to Nashville 2 or 3 times and recorded and done some roundtable discussions. And actually, we're going up there in a couple of weeks because we're doing like a work session, and there are multiple people who are coming and investigators coming to kind of go over back to what you were talking about, all the, are going to mention about all the things that are being posted. And, there's a lot of armchair investigators and a lot of people who, the same people who listen to your podcast and who get very involved, and they're very, the whole crowdsourcing, they really help, and they are all over social media and the different podcast discussion groups, and they take screenshots and they keep it. And so we're kind of getting everyone together and going to have kind of a work session weekend and look at all the different things that people have said and done, and compare notes, basically.
Right. And so what you're going through right now, you had mentioned to me that this particular individual, who happens to be the same individual and group that attacked the Melgar family when the victim's family in our case were doing the same thing to you and your son. And then I listened to the podcast, and it's amazing. The exact same thing seems to have happened. You guys were fighting for documents from was it the Attorney General or the DA's office? Yeah.
The Attorney General, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, somebody comes in who is, because, I mean, the parallels are crazy. If for those of you listening here haven't listened to season 6 of Truth and Justice, the same thing was happening. We're fighting for documents, and we were attacking the case, and they had really botched this investigation, and the prosecutor had done a terrible job, and she had lied about things and was hiding things. And so, of course, we exposed that. That's what we do. And then here comes this guy that the way it looked to me in that case was, hey, I can give you some publicity on the other side of this. I can, if you help me get what I need and help guide me, I can make my own podcast and my own group, or we'll discredit what they're doing over on Truth and Justice. And a lot of people deny things, but we know that we had expert witnesses from the trial were in their group. The prosecutor's friends and family were in the group, and they were just a really ugly group of people. The way they approach people, we went through it. It was really hard on Liz Rose, who was the victim's daughter in that case. That was working with us. I mean, they had people getting into infiltrating her personal Facebook account and pulling her pictures up and just really trying to make a living out of attacking her and just being, and we always had the drinking game of, I only ever listened to one and a half episodes that he made, but of how many times he says Bob Ruff in his podcast, because he was just piggybacking off our podcast to try to become popular. And then sure enough, another very popular true crime podcast, Culpable, comes up, and here he comes again with his new season, which is doing the same thing to you guys.
Yes, it's same situation. We've got a DA involved who, her husband is involved in that discussion group that they have, and her family, all her family members are involved, and she's probably involved in a fake profile. The Whitley family, Jet Miller's family, the Dillon family, that same little group that has been very vicious on social media, and has, of course, in our situation, and I don't know if that happened in yours, in our situation, in the midst of all of this, there was a DA election, and Bilbo Mitchell, who was the DA for 32 years, I think it is here, and who, there was questions about if his son, well, we know that his son had information and his son, but we just, we don't know that his son was actually physically there and involved. But he retired early before his term was up and appointed Cassie Coleman, or had the governor appoint Cassie Coleman. And so she was an assistant DA in his office at the time, and, she, was handpicked by him to take this position. And then the election came during kind of the podcast, and, of course, the podcast ended in, I think, September, and or August, and the election was in November. And she narrowly won by 600 votes. And it was very polarizing for our community, and it became very ugly. And she has, in my opinion, been very unprofessional and been very unethical in things that she's done, and kind of like what you were talking about in your case. She, the DA has done things, and she was behind encouraging the case files to be released by the Attorney General's office. She used to work at the Attorney General's office, so she had relationships there that, they were willing to accommodate her. And, I think it was all for political reasons. They thought that the case file would be released and it would turn people against us. And actually the opposite happened. We gained a huge amount of support because, because of the unfairness and the just really cruel way it was done. And, when you have her family members posting it on their Facebook page and saying, oh, here's the case file that's got the autopsy photos in them, and here they are in a Dropbox, and you have, her on tape saying, can we release it? Can we release it? Talking about the case file. You have the father going to people's homes saying, oh, come on up to the DA's office and we'll show you how it's a suicide. And, we've got the pictures and we've got this, that, and the other. It's very unprofessional and I've been really surprised that, it's really prosecutorial misconduct. Even the release of the case file is, and we've gone back and forth about reporting her and multiple other people that was involved that were attorneys at the Attorney General's office about it. It went totally against the Attorney General's typical policy. They typically do not release case files, period. They just don't. And it falls under the exemption because they consider it work product of an investigation. Mm-hmm. And in Mississippi's public records laws, they have that as an exception. And so, they released the case file totally unredacted. It had people's social security numbers, their dates of birth, their full names. The interesting thing is they released everything, that wasn't like a copied document, like it was a document from the police department or something. But as far as all the text messages, a lot of the just Word documents, it was all released in PDF format so it could all be changed. It wasn't, you could go in there and change what a text message said. You could go in there and change anything you want to. And actually, some people did that kind of stuff and then would post it, and then people would say, well, that's not what my copy says. And then they would take it down.
Right. We ran into some similar situations like that as well.
Yeah. And, they released his death certificate, which is a protected document. It's not supposed to be, released to anyone but family and law enforcement. And, of course, again, they released all the autopsy photos.
And see, I'm not entirely familiar with Mississippi or at all, but I've dealt with a lot of other states with open record laws, and I thought it was federal privacy laws that they were off the Federal Freedom of Information Act, where you run into exceptions that can't be released. Number one, for sure, people's personal information like Social Security numbers, even dates of birth, aren't supposed to be released. And then every state that I've worked in, they won't release any autopsy photos or even crime scene photos that contain pictures of the body. They'll redact the body out. because they're not supposed to, for the dignity of the victim, not give that information out except to family. So oftentimes, if I need those crime scene photos, a family member will request them for me because that's the only way they can be released. I can't believe they just dumped all that out to just a random guy with a, you know what I mean, with a podcast. I mean, I can believe it, but it's certainly unethical, if not illegal.
Well, now he did the only podcast that has gotten the records, because I FOIA'd the FOIA, so I knew exactly who had gotten and requested the records. And the podcast that you're referring to, he's gotten all of his information from I guess you'd say, the people of interest, from their family.
Oh, so he didn't personally file the FOIA request. They did, and then gave it to him. Gave it to him.
Right. And he has said that on his podcast that he did not FOIA it.
Yes. See, in our case, he had filed it, but along with, he had the district attorney working to make sure he got everything that he needed. And it's just, I mean, I guess I'm sorry you're going through it. I know what it's like. It doesn't bother me when it's, because I'm not involved in I'm not the victim. I'm not the victim's family. I work in the public space, so I get, attacked daily. I can't say anything without upsetting someone, but for you, the family, to be dealing with I know how they operate. Everything is an attack. They will try to twist everything, try to make you look bad. I mean, that's how this guy. It's funny because he always says that I don't do this for the money. I do this. I don't have any sponsors. I'm not reading ads. I just do this for truth and justice. But it always thinks like, yeah, because there's like 100 people listening to his podcast, so no one's offering to give him any money. I guarantee you, if he ever got bigger and sponsors came, then it would be, well, we've decided to take sponsorships because we want to do more good work. But he'll never get there because of the ugliness of and the negativity that he puts out there. But I guess what I'm getting at is my advice to you is, don't breathe any oxygen into it. Don't, because I've been there. Don't get sucked in, because then you just want to fight, and that's all. People with that mentality, that's all they want, is to drama and to fight and argue, because they're trying to get famous off of your misfortune is what's happening.
Well, I think that the people who flock to them are, they lack credibility, and the people who do participate in that, whether it's a discussion group or whatever, it's typically people who lack credibility themselves. I mean,
right.
Just being associated with a product like that makes you not credible. And so, and I have been surprised at a couple of people have said, I don't go on I'm not going to go over there or listen to it or whatever, because I really don't care what that group of people think or say. It's like someone, I will get messages and say, can you tell me this, and this, because they are saying this, and this, and, we need to prove that they're wrong. And I'm like, I don't have to prove anything to anybody other than
right.
a new DA. Not going to prove it to Kathy, but to a new DA or to the Department of Justice or the Attorney General's office. I said, I don't care. They can't arrest anybody for me. They can't keep anybody from being arrested. They have no authority. So I could care less what their theory or what their perception is, because at the end of the day, we know that they know that Christian was killed, and they aren't. But I could have a signed confession from Whitley or Dylan or whoever, and they would say, well, you paid him to do that. Or it's always that I paid somebody to do something.
Right.
But they can have something come up that they can't even validate or verify, but we're supposed to take that as fact just because they said it.
Right.
And so I really am not very worried about their narrative, because I'm very confident in our forensics and in our investigators. And I just, I've been told over and over, even by other law enforcement people who aren't, connected with the case, that there's just no, there's just too many questions there. There's too many red flags. There's too many lies that's been told for there not to be something that went on.
Right. And there's the way that they operate over there too. You're never going to, even those friends or whoever that are, I need this information to prove them wrong. You can't prove anybody wrong over there. As soon as you disagree with them, they mute you or block you or kick you out and attack you. So it's completely a wasted effort. And if you just look at where the whole thing comes from, look at, after he piggybacked off our podcasts in their last season, they are going to, take another case so they can keep bringing truth and justice to the world. But really, at the end of the day, they did the exact same thing. They're taking a case that is already attached to an online social media and podcast audience, and then trying to create drama to draw those listeners over. There's no dignity in what they're doing. It's not worth the argument. And as I always say, no one's ever changed anyone's mind about anything on the internet. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
Rae, I think it's a good time to wrap things up. I want to thank you. You have my deepest condolences for the loss of your son and for what you've been through. I admire you, that your fight, that you're continuing to try to find the truth and try to get justice for your son, even in the face of everything you're facing. And I certainly really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us.
Okay, well, I appreciate you having me on, and I will start listening to your podcast.
Fantastic.